right, now we're joined by Stephanie Bowman, who's running for re-election to the Port Commission position 3. So go ahead with a 2-minute introduction.
All right, great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's been a busy 4 years on the Port Commission. When I was here 4 years ago, and if you look back at my voter pamphlet statement 4 years ago, the first thing that I identified as a goal for me was trying to find a way for the Port of Seattle and Tacoma to have a better working relationship, because I think most people recognize over about the last 60 years it was becoming a really corrosive relationship where we were losing jobs in the region. I took that on literally from the first day that I was on the Port Commission. A year and a half later, I led the effort for the Port of Seattle in negotiating that agreement, which has resulted in the Northwest Seaport Alliance, which is a formal partnership between the two ports. In the last year, that has resulted in a 6% increase in marine cargo throughout the gateway, which means we're keeping hundreds of jobs here in the Seattle-Tacoma region. In addition to that, the other thing that I've really taken a big lead on at the Port of Seattle is pushing our internship program. A year and a half ago, we were talking with staff, and I said wanted our goal to be that we triple the amount of interns that we have at the Port of Seattle. They pushed back on me. They said the best we could do is maybe double it. I didn't even know what the number was, but I give them a lot of credit. They actually tripled it. We went from 34 interns, actually more than tripled, up to 150 interns this year. Those are both high school and college internships that are paid. They're great positions. The reason why that's so important is because it gives kids that might not go to a four-year university, a career path. They can go into maritime, airport, fishing industry, environmental, all the industries that the Port of Seattle supports. And for me, that's all about keeping a middle class in the city of Seattle, which I have a real issue with. I think that we're really losing the middle class and opportunities for that. So providing youth with that kind of pathway and that vision of something else that they could do. I've got a lot of environmental priorities I can talk about later as well. A lot at SeaTac Airport in particular, because this airport has a huge environmental footprint. With 44 million passengers coming through the airport every year, we have a lot that we contribute carbon-wise, and then also just our impact on the airport communities.
Great, thank you. So now we have our 4 prepared questions that we're asking all candidates for Port, and they're actually right in front of you if you want to turn it over and read along with us as we read them aloud. I think we left off, Ben. Will you do number 1?
All right, great. So just jump in.
Oh no, he's going to read it aloud for the camera.
Okay, fantastic. Okay.
What is your plan to keep the Port of Seattle competitive when other ports offer similar services at lower costs?
Well, I think I covered that in the beginning. Is number 1, our partnership with the Port of Tacoma, because again, we were fighting against one another for these 60 years, but what would happen is we would lower our price to get a customer, and then Tacoma would lower their price, and the customers would go between the two ports, and what that meant was we had less revenue to reinvest in the terminals. And you see that, for example, in Tacoma at Terminals 3 and 4 and Terminal 5 at the Port of Seattle. By joining the two ports together under one management team, we're marketing the entire region. And so we're able to offer better services and again, take that market share back from Canada, which quite frankly is our biggest competitor. Those are fantastic jobs. The longshore jobs that go along with that, the trucking jobs, I mean, everything that supports the marine cargo business is critical to the region. And so having that partnership with Tacoma is probably the single best thing we can do.
Great, Bevan, number 2.
So what is your position on releasing the port facilities to oil drilling operations?
To oil drilling operations, I don't support it in terms of oil drilling or exports for Port of Seattle, either coal or oil. I actually have a little bit of a personal perspective. I have a small house in Mosier, Oregon. I don't know if anybody's aware, but that was where the oil train derailed last summer. I was actually one of the first 3 people on the scene. I helped evacuate the elementary school that was about 150 yards from the oil track. So, and actually on my phone, I'm happy to show some horrible pictures of what that looked like. So it gave me just the most incredible first-hand experience of the danger of having coal coming through communities. What I've done since then is really specific, starting to work with the railroads and other local governments to figure out how we can make our communities more safe. There's a lot of things that we can do specifically to require the railroads to have safer operations, and most importantly, have emergency procedures if something happens. Because what happened in Mosier, there weren't any emergency procedures really in place. And what that means is they actually had to bring in trucks from Portland and Seattle to be able to put out the oil fire. It was incredible. If you've seen something like that, imagine if that was in downtown Seattle. So there's a lot of things that tie into that issue. That's not just about importing and exporting, but thinking about how to make our communities safe for those products.
Great. Sarah, number 3.
What changes or reforms do you support for the Port Commission itself?
You know, I think the most important thing that we can do is continue to provide the policy guidance for the staff. You know, I know some people have talked about wanting to make the Port Commission full-time, more like the City Council or the County Council. I don't necessarily support that. I don't think that we need more full-time elected officials. I think it should be a public service job. I think it should be part-time. That's what it is right now. That's what it's been for over 100 years. That said, what our responsibility is to make sure that we're giving that policy guidance and that the staff is implementing the policy. I can give a couple of examples, and one's a small one, but it's actually really important. When I started on the Port Commission, I'm a really big proponent of sound transit. Like, I'm the poster child for sound transit. And so I love light rail. I take it to the airport all the time. And it drove me nuts that anybody that's taken light rail to the airport, you know, the walkway between the light rail station and the terminal is horrible. Open to the, you know, the elements, freezing cold, terrible signage, yada, yada, yada. So I was pushing staff for 3 years, like, we've got to fix this, and they just wouldn't do it. And I couldn't understand why. And finally, we got to budget season last year, and I said, you guys are doing this. Like, I'm writing this into the budget. You're going to do this. And within, I don't know, 12 hours, they suddenly have a plan. And if you've been to the airport recently, you've seen, right? We have beautiful side. We've got the big windows up on the walkway. I don't. It looks like nobody's been to the airport. I'm like, really? Pictures we take this summer. We have these great panels up there. We're putting heaters in. We have golf carts for people that have mobility problems. I mean, those are, so sometimes we have to really push back on staff to like really. Oh, I don't think our job is to get into the day-to-day operations, but there's times when you kind of really have to push back on it. Another example I would use quickly is our operations with the taxis and the TNCs. We had to really push the staff on our contract to require the taxis and TNCs to use hybrid vehicles at the airport. We're actually the only airport in the country that's required that, which I think is a big deal. So those are sorts of things we do on the Port Commission, I think is the appropriate level.
David, number 4.
Do you believe we have achieved full transparency in the port's contracting and compensation practices? And where do you see possibilities for further improvement?
No, I don't think we've achieved full transparency, because even as a port commissioner, I would say I know everything about our contracting. But what I can say is that, again, our job is to set the goals, and things like stepping out on I-200, for example, is something that we're working. I am really proud that all 5 port commissioners support overturning I-200 and trying to find ways around, quite honestly, around the current law, legally, but find ways to be able to do contracting with women and minority businesses. Doing that through things like our leases at the airport. We provided extra points for small businesses, which tend to be more women and minority businesses. Everything that we can possibly do to provide those opportunities. In terms of greater transparency on compensation, I'm not exactly sure what the question is on that. Can I get a little clarification?
We have to keep all the questions identical for everybody.
Oh, that's
so
fine.
no.
Okay. Well, I'll
we
just.
can address it in the follow-up if you'd like.
Okay, that sounds good. So, I'll just continue to talk about more transparency, because there can always be more transparency. I think probably my greatest insight being on the Port Commission is people don't pay a lot of attention. I mean, I'm shocked by how many people don't come to Port Commission meetings. I don't want to ask you to raise your hand about how many of you watched a Port Commission meeting. My mom watches it every Sunday. It's on the Seattle channel. She tells me when she's like, stand up straight, and, she pays attention. It's fantastic. It's probably because I have a daughter. But people don't pay attention until there's some sort of controversy, and I would just encourage people, it's a two-way street. We can be transparent. All these meetings are in public. Everything's in public. It's noticed, but people don't show up. So there's things we could do, like going to evening meetings. We've talked about that. I can tell you the staff has pushed back on that, but I'm like, it's hard for people to get downtown in the middle of the day. It's almost impossible unless you have a concerted reason to be down there. So those, I think, are some of the things we can do to get the public more engaged.
Great. So now we'll open it up to follow-up questions. These are 1-minute answers. And Sarah, would you like to go first?
You talked about your efforts to decrease the carbon footprint of the port.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that and what your future plans are?
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's so many things. So I'm going to talk about most specifically the airport because I think that's probably got our biggest carbon footprint. So one of the things, the single biggest contributor to greenhouse gases at the airport is aviation fuel. Hands down, number one, nobody pays attention to it, but it's the single biggest thing. It's also something that we don't have control over necessarily. But what we have done 2.5 years ago is we partnered with Boeing, Washington State University, and Alaska Airlines to start looking at bringing biofuels to the airport. And my longer term goal is to actually be the airport on the West Coast that provides that for the airlines. It's a really complicated process in terms of producing the biofuels, and as I said to our staff, for example, they looked at getting the biofuels from the Midwest. I'm like, well, why would we get the biofuels from the Midwest and then truck them to the Port of Seattle? That would kind of ruin the idea of having a smaller footprint. So what we're trying to do, I said, let's look at opportunities for Eastern Washington to provide biofuels, but then you have to figure out a pipeline. So it's complicated, but long term, it's a really big deal as the airport and the region continues to grow. Other things, again, promoting sound transit to the airport. The more people that we can get out of their vehicles and get onto sound transit is huge. And it's not just for getting in and out of the airport, it's backing up Burien, SeaTac, Des Moines, I-5. I mean, you just kind of get people out of their cars. And then that kind of goes again to the why we required the TNCs, Uber and Lyft, and the taxi cabs to have the cafe standards and the hybrids, because again, there's thousands of vehicles coming into SeaTac. I have to stop talking. I could go on and on. I just have water bottles too. 44 million water bottles is a lot.
Additional questions?
Please.
David, yeah.
Other airports where there's like a long walk to
Mhm.
a train have moving sidewalks.
Yep, they do.
And how come we don't?
So a couple of reasons. So this is an interesting story. I'm going to try and keep it really quick. I actually worked on the very first Sound Transit initiative. Not the one in the 60s, obviously, but the one back in the 90s. And they were talking about the Sound Transit station actually being almost a mile away from the airport. The compromise is where it is now. They never built it into the budget. And so a moving walkway is almost $30 million to put it in from the current Sound Transit station to the terminal. That's a lot of money. What we're looking at long term for the airport is potentially extending the terminal, potentially, don't quote me on this necessarily, but looking at the parking garage as maybe an extension of the terminal. So we're not going to spend the $30 million on the walkway right now until we have that plan figured out. But moving forward, once we have the master plan figured out, we'll absolutely put in a moving walkway. But the Sound Transit station might move, or the terminal might move. So it's not a good investment right now, which is why we're doing the mobility cards.
Great. Additional questions? None?
Hi.
So, working on helping you out of this one,
Oh, okay.
help me understand what the port's contracting and compensation packages are, and do you see improvement happening in that area?
Okay, well, so we don't really have so we contract with everybody for all kinds of different services. And so here's a good example. We've got like major contractors that handle big projects like the International Rivals facility at the airport. And one of the things we can do is require them to use small disadvantaged minority-owned businesses in that contract. But that's only a really small percentage. What I think we need to do is extend that further throughout the port. So one thing I've talked to our staff about is actually having goals for each department: economic development, marine, fishing, at Fisherman's Terminal, etc., and requiring them to have small business and minority goals so that it's not just on the big projects, but throughout so every employee is incentivized to think about how can we provide more opportunities to more small and disadvantaged businesses in the area. And when you only do it on the big capital projects, then it's only a small subset of those like major contractors that do that work, and you're not thinking about things like, office supplies and coffee. And I know that doesn't sound big, but it actually is big. I mean, it really does add up, and it's where small businesses can actually compete.
John, answer.
Both the seaport and the airport are surrounded by communities that have high immigrant and refugee populations. What else can the port do under this administration to help support those communities, in addition to providing good jobs and minority contracting incentives? What else can the port do?
Well, I think number one, we've done a lot. I actually, so this is kind of a personal note too, so I think though it's important, during the day, my full-time job, I'm the executive director of a statewide organization that works on poverty alleviation. And so One America, for example, is one of my big partners, if you're familiar with One America and the work that they do. And so we're partnering, so because of my day job work with One America, brought them into the port, and we're partnering with them to provide training opportunities so our immigrant populations at the airport can learn about what their rights are under this administration. I think that's really important because the executive order in January was just a huge wake-up call for people. We know, literally nobody saw it coming. I mean, we didn't know it at the airport until the evening before, midnight, Friday night at midnight, and suddenly we get word these people are not going to be let into the country. So we were all just taken back by it. But what's more important is making sure that they know their rights, they have legal representation at the port. We have a room set aside. We've got working with One America to have attorneys on site. We're providing basic things like food, information to the families, those sorts of things that haven't really been done at other airports. But I think it's especially important at SeaTac because of the populations that we serve.
Great, Sarah.
Can you talk a little bit about the efforts to bring a livable wage to SeaTac? If you took a position on those efforts and whether or not you think they've been effective?
Yeah, I think they've been really effective. I think they've been effective in a lot of different ways. A couple of things. The jobs at the airport they're kind of your basic retail jobs, except they're a lot harder for a couple reasons that most people don't pay attention to. First of all, you have to get to the airport, so it's expensive even if you're taking light rail down there. You work terrible hours. You're working, you have to get behind security, and so you have to have security clearance in order to do that. I mean, there are things that if you were working at Ivers downtown, you would never have to do, but you have to do things at the airport. If people are willing to do that, we've got to make sure that it's a job that they've got benefits at, that they're actually, so it's not just about the livable wage, but it's about employee benefits as well, providing decent health care, even things like employee meals and employee parking or orca passes to get to and from the airport. Because quite frankly, they're not big career jobs. The other thing that we can do, which other airports have done, are provide training facilities so that we can actually, what we want to do is actually, if people want it, have a career out of retail. So some people want to stay in the retail jobs, but if you want a career in management, if you want to get moved, for example, from a baggage handler to something else at Alaska Airlines, we want to be able to provide those opportunities.
Time for
This 1 minute thing is
I know. Got time for maybe one more question, two more questions? Okay, so I'll ask one. You had said, I think that freight traffic was up, I think 6% since
marine cargo.
Marine cargo.
Yeah.
I was wondering how that compares with whether it rose or fell in Canada. Is it Prince Rupert? Is that the name of it?
Prince Rupert, yeah.
Did it go up there as well? Are we beating them, or is this
actually,
just?
no, it looks like we took it from the Port of Vancouver.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, which is fantastic. And that's actually our biggest competition is the Canadian ports. And the reason why it's Canadian ports, Vancouver and Prince Rupert in particular, because the Canadian government pours federal dollars and local dollars into their port. We don't get any federal dollars. We get it at the airport, but we get nothing at the marine terminals. So it's all supported by essentially the fees that we get from the terminal operators. And so, but the Canadian government has this whole plan of, they call it the Gateway Plan, and so they just pour this money into their ports, and they figure out they've got the rail connections, the truck connections, and at Prince Rupert in particular, the cargo comes in there, it goes straight across Canada, drops into Minnesota, and goes down into the Chicago basin. And that's just really hard to compete with. So by having the ports of Seattle and Tacoma join, we're marketing the entire region. So when a customer comes in, now they can look at the North Harbor, which is what we call Seattle, and the South Harbor, which is what we call Tacoma, and we have choices for them, and we're not competing. And so they might fit in Seattle, they might fit in Tacoma, but both ports benefit. But most importantly, residents throughout the entire Puget Sound benefit because we split the revenue equally, 50-50, Seattle, Tacoma. So there's no incentive to compete anymore.
Great. So we're about out of time. If you want to take 30 seconds for a closing statement.
Okay, this is fast. I'll just say thank you. I mean, again, I guess maybe I'll push a little bit and ask you to just get engaged. I mean, I know that all of you are engaged in your day-to-day life, but the port is really important. And probably the thing that drives me the most is being able to have a diverse economy in the city of Seattle. I mean, we talk a lot about what the port does, and we talk about how it does it, but we don't really talk about why it does what it does. And in my opinion, what the port does is provide opportunity. But it needs to provide opportunity that's equitable throughout the region so everybody can benefit from that opportunity, and it needs to be sustainable. And we can't have a port without those three things. And so I would just encourage people to get more involved and pay attention to the opportunity, the livability, and the equity. And if we don't have those things, then we're not doing our job.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.